Thank you all for being here. I think we're going to get started. It's wonderful for you all to have shared your Sunday afternoon with us. We really appreciate it. It means you really don't want New Mexico to become a national nuclear sacrifice area, so we really appreciate you. And to begin, we're going to have an acknowledgement. My name is Robin. I'm a co-host with Eileen O'Shaughnessy from DNA, Demand Nuclear Abolition. DNA, yes, it's in our DNA.
Hi, everybody. Yes, my name is Eileen O'Shaughnessy, and I'm a co-founder of a grassroots anti-nuclear collective based in Albuquerque on Tiwa land there. And I want to just say, first of all, before we begin, that we are on occupied Tiwa lands here in what's called Santa Fe. And that's really important to say because with nuclear issues, indigenous peoples are on the forefront. And the process of nuclear colonialism is ongoing. And really the goal of this work is to challenge nuclear colonialism, the violence of radioactive materials, which harm communities of color and indigenous people the most.
Thanks for that, Eileen. And we have other thanks. I'd like to thank the Courtyard by Marriott and specifically Phyllis Ortiz-Hilborn for helping us today put this together. Yes, thank you, Phyllis. Santa Fe Audiovisual, Chris and Bobby, thank you so much for being here and helping with the sound and the Zoom and everything else. Available Media, Bob Ailey, thank you. There'll be stuff up on the web and live streamed. And also I want to thank all our coalition members. So Concerned Citizens for Nuclear Safety, Southwest Research and Information Center, Vets for Peace, Nuke Watch, Citizens for Alternatives to Radioactive Dumping. And I also really want to acknowledge Deborah Reed from CCNS and CARD because she has really spearheaded this. So kudos to Deborah. Cecilia Chavez is our Spanish interpreter. With that, we're going to go to our first PowerPoint presentation. Eileen, what is Wipp? Take it away, girl.
All right. So this first PowerPoint is going to go over what Wipp is, the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant. Many people have forgotten about Wipp in the last 20 years. So the first question is, what is Wipp? Wipp is the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, a radioactive and hazardous waste dump site 26 miles east of Carlsbad in southeastern New Mexico. Wipp is the first and only deep geologic repository for radioactive waste in the world. Wipp's mission is to permanently dispose of waste forever, or at least keep it separated from the accessible environment for 10,000 years. It is called a pilot plant because it was supposed to be the first of multiple repositories. It was designed only to dispose of a portion of the defense radioactive waste inventory. Other sites were to be developed to receive the rest of that inventory and for waste generated in the future. Next slide. So who owns Wipp? The U.S. Department of Energy, or DOE, operates Wipp and controls the 16-mile square site. Wipp has received waste from more than 20 sites around the country that have generated plutonium-contaminated waste. Next slide. Generator sites. These generator sites store, characterize, and package waste for shipment to Wipp. Los Alamos National Laboratory, or LANL, in northern New Mexico, not far from where we are, is the main generator site in our state. Waste is shipped by truck. Next slide. The Wipp facility, as originally conceived, includes surface structures where waste is received, temporarily stored, and sent to the underground. The mine, or the underground, is where waste is placed for permanent disposal. 4 shafts connect the two, as you can see here. Next slide. Surface structures include The waste handling building, where waste is received, unpacked, and sent underground for disposal. Various ventilation intake and exhaust openings. The exhaust filter building, where underground air can be filtered. The surface parking lot and a storage area for waste waiting to be unloaded. And the salt storage area for salt excavated from the underground to be used again during closure of the facility. And that's salt from an ancient sea. Next slide. The underground repository is excavated 2,150 feet below the surface and was originally planned to have 8 waste panels made up of 7 rooms each, arranged along the main corridors. Each panel was to be about 300 feet long, 33 feet wide, and 13 feet high, about the length and width of a football field. The areas between the main corridors, also known as drifts, were called panels 9 and 10 and were to be filled as Wipp was being closed. Next slide. As shown on the right, contact-handled waste is stacked in the rooms after the hotter remote-handled waste, shown on the left, is robotically placed in pre-drilled holes in the room walls. More recently, some remote-handled waste has been put into lead-shielded containers and stacked with the contact-handled waste. Next slide. Wipp's original design included 4 shafts. The construction and salt handling shaft is used during salt excavation, construction, and eventual closure of the corridors, panels, and rooms. Number 2, the waste shaft is used to move waste from the waste handling building to the underground. Number 3, the air intake shaft sends fresh air to the underground ventilation system. And number 4, the exhaust shaft. Originally, air was exhausted to the environment from the underground through this shaft. Exhausted air could be filtered through a bank of HEPA filters if there was a radiation release. Next slide. On Valentine's Day, 2014, a notorious day, I had a bad Valentine's Day that year as well, 1 or more waste drums exploded in the Wipp underground in room 7 of panel 7, releasing radioactive and hazardous waste into the environment and contaminating the mine and part of the exhaust shaft. 22 workers were also contaminated above ground. 9 days before, there had been a truck fire underground, which resulted in the evacuation of all underground personnel at the time, so that no one was in the underground when the release occurred. After the accident, no waste was shipped to or disposed at Wipp for 3 years. The explosion was caused by improper waste packaging at Los Alamos National Labs, the generating site for this waste. The wrong kind of kitty litter was added to the waste to absorb liquids. This turned the waste into an explosive mixture. Several hundred of these drums had already been disposed of at Wipp. Next slide. Because parts of the underground and the exhaust shaft were contaminated after the accident, all air had to be filtered through the HEPA filters. This greatly reduced the amount of underground ventilation and the amount of work that could be done in the mine. Though Wipp's motto at the beginning was, quote, "Start clean and stay clean," eventually, Wipp started bypassing the filters and exhausting contaminated air while doing some underground tasks. This continues to be a practice today. Since the radiation release, there has been new construction that is part of the Wipp expansion. This includes a new 5th shaft that is being excavated as we speak, west of the repository footprint. At first, DOE refused to acknowledge that the new shaft had any use other than for ventilation, but now DOE calls it a utility shaft and says that it will be used for new construction and a waste hoist in the future. Next slide. The current Wipp site was designed in 1975, after the first site a few miles away was abandoned because of unpredictable geology. Previously, a site near Lyons, Kansas had been selected, but it was abandoned because of unpredictable geology and opposition from Kansas officials. Other states declined to be considered. However, a few local people in Carlsbad requested that the federal government consider this area. All of those sites were in salt formations because salt creeps or closes in on itself. And it was believed that salt creep would encapsulate the waste underground forever, far from the surface and the accessible environment. Next slide. In addition to predictable geology, a major siting criteria was to avoid resource extraction, potash, oil, and gas that existed in the region, because such drilling and mining would increase the likelihood of human intrusion into Wipp that could release radioactivity. In 1975, there was little drilling within 10 miles of the site in 1975. But now, Wipp is surrounded by resources and resource extraction. There are potash reserves above Wipp and oil and gas below it. There are more than 500 oil and gas wells within 2.5 miles of Wipp, and thousands of wells in the larger Permian Basin area. DOE can prevent any drilling within the 16 square mile Wipp site, the gray area in the slide, but only for as long as it can maintain control of the area. Another important siting criteria was to avoid earthquakes. It's a good idea. But some of the wells use hydraulic fracturing or fracking that could allow liquids to move into the waste underground. Fracking can also create earthquakes that could affect the integrity of Wipp. Next slide. There are some other reasons why some people have always considered the Wipp site to be unsuitable. Number one, the Wipp facility is sited in one of the largest karst areas in the United States. Karst geology develops when the underground rocks are dissolved away by water. This allows liquids to move quickly through fractures, channels, and caverns in the dissolved rock. Number two, the salt surrounding Wipp is not pure, but is crossed, sometimes for hundreds of miles, by rock layers called interbeds, where liquids can also travel more quickly. Wipp is located close between two interbeds. Number three, underneath Wipp is a large pocket of brine, highly pressurized by hydrogen sulfide gas. Breaching this pocket by drilling through the salt could bring quantities of brine into the underground and perhaps into the accessible environment. The Wipp underground was rotated away from a Wipp drill hole that hit a large brine pocket, but part of the site still remains above this brine pocket. Next slide. For a more detailed description of the Wipp site and site geology, go to www.cardnm.org. There are both technical and non-technical sections available. Next slide. Now let's talk a little bit about the kind of waste that is disposed of in Wipp. First, there are three major types of nuclear waste. Number one, high-level waste, or spent nuclear fuel, is waste from reprocessing fuel rods and spent rods from commercial nuclear power plants, which we do not have in New Mexico, FYI. Number two, Low-level waste is medical, industrial, or nuclear fuel cycle waste that doesn't fit into other waste categories. Number 3, transuranic or true waste is waste that is contaminated with human-made radioactive elements heavier than uranium, like plutonium. This waste is mostly nuclear weapons waste. Next slide. Because of federal law and the consultation and cooperation agreement between DOE and New Mexico, only transuranic waste can come to Wipp. So now we'll introduce the transuranics who will be performing at the Kiva Auditorium tonight. Just kidding. I hope they're not, right? Transuranic elements are all human-made and radioactive and are circled in blue in the periodic table of elements shown here. They are all heavier than uranium in the red box. That is, they are beyond or uranic, on the periodic table of elements and have atomic numbers greater than uranium's number 92. Plutonium's atomic number is 94. Next slide. So what else is special about the Wipp waste? The radioactive waste disposed in Wipp is only transuranic, military waste generated in nuclear weapons research, testing, and production. The waste is not made up of pure transuranic elements, but is made up of things like gloves, booties, sludges, etc., that are contaminated by transuranic elements, mostly the element plutonium. Most Wipp waste is contact-handled transuranic waste, or CH-true, meaning it can be handled without special shielding. Some is remote-handled transuranic waste, or RH-true, meaning it is so radioactive that it must be handled robotically or with extra shielding. Most Wipp waste includes hazardous chemicals and materials and is defined as mixed waste. Waste created before Wipp opened in 1999 is often called legacy waste. There is also newly generated waste as some generator sites continue to create new waste. For many years, DOE said that Wipp was primarily for cleaning up legacy waste, including legacy waste stored at Los Alamos National Laboratory. Next slide. So who regulates Wipp? The two most important regulators that have authority to allow Wipp to operate or not are the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, and the New Mexico Environment Department, or NMED. In 1998, EPA certified that Wipp was able to contain the radioactive waste buried there for 10,000 years after Wipp closes. Every 5 years, EPA must recertify that Wipp continues to meet that standard. However, consider this. The half-life of plutonium-239 is 24,000 years. That's how long it takes for only half of the volume of plutonium to change into something else. Even after 24,000 years, a quarter of the original volume of plutonium will still remain, along with many other dangerous radionuclides. Next slide. Wipp is regulated by the state of New Mexico through the New Mexico Environment Department, or NMED, under a federal law called RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and a state law called the Hazardous Waste Act. These laws regulate hazardous waste and materials, including hazardous waste that is mixed with radioactive waste, like the Wipp mixed waste. Although not all Wipp waste is mixed waste, the state can still regulate Wipp as a hazardous waste facility because DOE and the state agreed to manage all the waste in Wipp as mixed waste, even if some of it didn't contain any hazardous materials. NMED does this by issuing an operating permit to Wipp, regulating how Wipp must operate, what kind of waste it can receive, how it should be built, and how it should be closed. The original operating permit for Wipp was issued in 1999 for a period of 10 years and has been modified many times and renewed once. We are in the middle of such a renewal process right now. Next slide. NMED regulation is important, and during the renewal process, you, friends, can comment on the draft permit. NMED must consider your comments if they are received before the end of the comment period, which is 5 o'clock on Wednesday, April 19th, this coming Wednesday. Many conditions in the existing permit have resulted from public comments in the past, so you can have an effect on Wipp's future. Toward the end of this conference, you will be able to write your own comments to NMED. Wipp's application for permit renewal makes some significant changes that will expand Wipp in several ways. Expansion will include expanding Wipp's size or underground footprint, the amount of waste it can hold, the kind of waste it can hold, how long it can operate before it is closed, and how many additional shipments of waste on our highways there will be. We call this Wipp expansion, and that is the subject of the next presentation. And I want to invite Joni Ahrens, the Director of Concerned Citizens for Nuclear Safety.